Deep in the heart of Mississippi, where Spanish moss drapes like funeral shrouds and the air itself seems to whisper secrets, there stood a plantation that time would remember for all the wrong reasons. The year was 1855, and slavery's iron grip strangled the land like morning fog that never lifts. Cotton fields stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, row after row of white bowls that looked like scattered bones in the dying light. But it wasn't the heat that made people shiver when they spoke of this place. It was her. Her name was Celia. She moved through the plantation like a shadow given form, her footsteps silent on the weathered wooden floors of the big house kitchen. The other enslaved workers would lower their voices when she passed, crossing themselves and muttering prayers their grandmothers had taught them in languages older than memory. There was something about Celia that made the very air grow cold. Something that made even the boldest among them look away when she turned her dark eyes in their direction. Her presence carried weight, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day, promising violence that hadn't yet broken loose. The quarters buzzed with whispered conversations that died the moment she appeared. Old women who had survived decades of brutality would fall silent, their weathered hands trembling as they made signs against evil. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts, sensing something their young minds couldn't name but their ancient souls recognized. "She ain't right," Martha would whisper to the others when the sun went down and shadows grew long. "Been watching her since she came here 3 years back. That woman carries darkness like other folks carry water." The cotton fields themselves seemed different when Celia walked among them. The plants grew strange where she passed. Too tall, too green, their bowls opening in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Birds wouldn't land in those sections, and the field hands reported that the cotton from Celia's rows felt wrong in their hands, cold even under the blazing Mississippi sun. At night, when exhausted workers collapsed into their beds, they spoke in hushed tones about the sounds that came from Celia's cabin. Not crying or praying like you'd expect from someone trapped in bondage, but something else entirely. A low humming that seemed to make the very walls vibrate. Words spoken in a tongue that predated human language. Some claimed they saw lights dancing around her windows when there was no fire inside, no candle burning. Others swore they witnessed her talking to things that weren't there, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that made listeners' skin crawl with unnamed dread. The overseer, a cruel man named Briggs, had learned to avoid Celia entirely. He'd tried to assert his authority over her once, early in her time at the plantation. The next morning he'd been found writhing in agony, his body covered in boils that appeared overnight. The doctor couldn't explain it, couldn't cure it, and it took 3 weeks for the mysterious affliction to disappear as suddenly as it had come. After that, Briggs gave Celia a wide berth, though he'd never admit his fear to anyone. But the other workers saw how his hand shook when he had to assign her tasks, how he'd stutter when forced to speak her name. The big house kitchen became Celia's domain by default rather than design. The previous cook had fled in the middle of the night, claiming she'd seen Celia's shadow moving independently of her body, stirring pots that contained no food, preparing meals for guests who existed only in nightmare. Master Thornfield, a man who believed only in what he could see, and Count dismissed such talk as superstitious nonsense. Celia cooked well, his guests praised her meals, and that was all that mattered to his practical mind. But even he felt something unsettling about her presence, though he'd never voiced such foolishness aloud. The kitchen itself began to change under Celia's influence. Herbs hung from the rafters in bundles that seemed to writhe in windless air. Jars lined the shelves, filled with substances that defied identification, powders that shifted color when observed, liquids that bubbled without heat, roots that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Workers assigned to help in the kitchen would find excuses to leave early, claiming sudden illness or urgent tasks elsewhere. They spoke of feeling watched by unseen eyes, of hearing whispers that seemed to come from the very walls, of ingredients that moved on their own when Celia's back was turned. As autumn approached and the harvest season neared its end, the whispers in the cotton fields grew more urgent. Something was building, gathering like pressure before a storm. The very land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever darkness Celia was preparing to unleash. The enslaved community began to feel it in their bones, a certainty that their quiet, strange sister was planning something that would change everything forever. They watched her with a mixture of terror and fascination, knowing that whatever came next would be written in blood and remembered in nightmares. But none of them, not even the wisest among them, could have imagined the horror that was already taking shape in Celia's mind, simmering like a pot that had been left too long on the fire. Celia hadn't always been a creature of shadows and whispered fears. Once she had been someone else entirely, a young woman with hope in her heart and songs on her lips, sold away from everything she'd ever known when her first master died in debt. She'd arrived at the Thornfield plantation on a Tuesday morning in 1852, chained in the back of a wagon with 3 other souls who wouldn't survive their first winter. The auctioneer had described her as docile and skilled in domestic arts. But even then, something in her eyes had made potential buyers hesitate. Those early months had been an education in cruelty that would have broken a lesser spirit. Briggs took particular pleasure in testing the resolve of new arrivals, and Celia bore the brunt of his attention with a silence that only seemed to inflame his sadistic nature further. She learned quickly that screaming brought more pain, that tears were seen as weakness to be exploited, and that the only way to survive was to disappear inside herself so completely that her body became merely a vessel going through the motions of existence. But something else was growing in that inner darkness where Celia retreated, something that fed on injustice and nurtured itself on rage, growing stronger with each humiliation, each casual cruelty, each night spent listening to the sounds of suffering that echoed through the quarters. Her grandmother's voice began to whisper in her dreams, speaking words in the old language that Celia had thought forgotten. Recipes, but not for food. Recipes for justice, for balance, for power that could flow through willing hands to unwilling recipients. The kitchen became her sanctuary and her laboratory. Officially, she was there to prepare meals for the big house, but in the quiet hours before dawn and after dusk, she began to experiment with knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required darker arts. At first, her experiments were small, almost innocent. A pinch of foxglove in the overseer's coffee to give him vivid nightmares. A few drops of pokeweed extract in Mrs. Thornfield's tea to ensure she spent the day doubled over with stomach cramps. Nothing fatal, nothing that couldn't be explained away as natural illness or bad luck. But the workers began to notice patterns. Briggs would wake screaming from dreams so terrifying that he'd pace the grounds until sunrise, his face pale and his hands shaking. Mrs. Thornfield developed a mysterious ailment that left her bedridden for days at a time, ranting about shadows that moved when no one was watching. The other enslaved people started giving Celia a different kind of respect, not the love reserved for friends or the gratitude shown to protectors, but the careful deference paid to something dangerous that might, for now, be on their side. Martha was the first to voice what others only dared think. "That girl's got the gift," she whispered to her closest friends during one of those hushed conversations that took place in the deep of night. "My mama had it, and her mama before that. It's in the blood passed down from the old country where women knew things that would make your hair turn white." The gift, as Martha called it, manifested in ways both subtle and terrifying. Celia's hands seemed to know things that her mind hadn't learned. She could identify poisonous plants by touch alone, could sense the exact moment when fermentation would turn beneficial herbs into deadly toxins, could measure dosages with a precision that suggested guidance from sources beyond the physical world. Her reputation spread through whispered warnings and nervous glances. Workers began reporting strange dreams after eating her food, visions of their deceased relatives, glimpses of futures both wonderful and terrible, prophetic nightmares that came true with unsettling frequency. The plantation's livestock started dying in ways that puzzled even experienced farmers. Healthy animals would be found dead in their stalls, their bodies unmarked but their eyes wide with what looked like terror. The plantation's prize bull, a creature worth more than most enslaved people, was discovered one morning lying stiff in the pasture, foam still wet around its muzzle. Dr. Hayes, called in to examine the mysterious deaths, could find no natural cause. The animals appeared to have died of fright, their hearts simply stopping as if they'd seen something so horrifying that life itself became unbearable. Celia watched these developments with the patience of someone who understood that true power required careful cultivation. She spoke even less than before, moving through her daily routines with mechanical precision while her inner world expanded into territories that would have horrified anyone foolish enough to glimpse them. She began collecting more exotic ingredients during her rare trips to town, trading her meager possessions for herbs and powders that legitimate healers wouldn't touch. Apothecaries would sell to her with nervous haste, eager to have her money but terrified to meet her eyes for too long. Root doctors from 3 counties away began seeking her out, drawn by stories of her abilities. They would arrive in the dead of night, conducting their business in hushed tones before disappearing back into the darkness. These meetings left Celia with new knowledge, new recipes, and new confidence in her growing abilities. The enslaved community found themselves caught between gratitude and terror. Celia's presence had made their lives marginally safer. Briggs was too distracted by his nightmares to be as casually cruel. Mrs. Thornfield was too ill to demand impossible standards, and even Master Thornfield seemed subdued, as if some instinct warned him against pushing too hard. But they also sensed that Celia was building toward something larger, something that would make her small acts of revenge look like child's games. They watched her with the fascination of people observing a storm gathering on the horizon, knowing that when it finally broke, nothing would ever be the same. As 1855 drew toward its close, Celia's transformation was nearly complete. The frightened young woman who had arrived in chains had become something else entirely. A force of nature shaped by suffering and honed by hatred into an instrument of perfect, patient vengeance. She was ready for the grand gesture that would write her name in history, ready to serve a meal that would be remembered long after every other detail of the plantation had faded into forgotten dust. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper embossed with the Thornfield family crest, delivered by hand to 17 of Mississippi's most prominent families. Master Thornfield's daughter, Margaret, was to be married to the son of a neighboring plantation owner, and no expense would be spared in celebrating the union of 2 of the county's most influential bloodlines. The date was set for November 15, 1855, a crisp autumn evening when the harvest moon would cast its silver light across the cotton fields like a blessing from heaven itself. Or perhaps, as events would later suggest, like the cold glow of a funeral shroud. In the far weeks leading up to the celebration, the Thornfield plantation buzzed with preparation. Seamstresses worked around the clock creating new livery for the house servants. Silver was polished until it gleamed like mirrors, and the grand dining room was transformed into a vision of Southern elegance that would have impressed royalty. But it was in the kitchen where the most important preparations were taking place, and it was there that Celia began the final phase of her carefully orchestrated plan. For 3 years, she had been patient. For 3 years, she had endured, learned, and grown in power while maintaining the facade of the docile house servant. Now, as she stood in her domain surrounded by the tools of her trade, she knew that her moment had finally arrived. The menu she proposed to Mrs. Thornfield was ambitious even by the standards of plantation hospitality. 7 courses, each more elaborate than the last, featuring delicacies that would showcase not only the family's wealth but also Celia's remarkable skills as a cook. Roasted duck with cherry glaze, venison steaks with wild mushroom sauce, sweet potato souffle, cornbread studded with herbs from her own secret garden. Mrs. Thornfield, still pale and weak from her mysterious recurring illness, approved the menu with barely a glance. She had learned to trust Celia's judgment in culinary matters, and besides, she was too preoccupied with other party preparations to pay much attention to kitchen details. What Mrs. Thornfield didn't know was that Celia had been planning this menu for months, carefully selecting each dish not for its flavor or presentation, but for its potential as a delivery system for the justice she intended to serve alongside the feast. The guest list read like a roll call of the county's most powerful oppressors. Judge Morrison, who had sentenced countless enslaved people to death with the casual indifference of a man swatting flies. Colonel Patterson and his wife, whose plantation was notorious for the cruelty of its overseers. The Weatherby family, whose fortune was built on the blood and sweat of people they considered less than livestock. 17 souls who had never questioned their right to own other human beings, who slept peacefully in their beds while others suffered in chains, who viewed the color of their skin as a divine endorsement of their superiority. 17 people who had no idea that their final judgment was about to be served on silver platters in the elegant dining room they considered their natural birthright. As the day of the celebration approached, the other workers began to notice changes in Celia's behavior. She worked with an intensity that bordered on fever, spending 20 hours a day in the kitchen, emerging only to gather ingredients from places that made even the bravest among them reluctant to follow. She ventured deep into the swamps where poisonous plants grew in abundance, returning with baskets full of specimens that she would process in the darkest hours of night. Mushrooms that glowed with their own eerie light, roots that twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly, berries that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Her herb garden, always strange, became positively otherworldly in those final weeks. Plants grew at impossible rates, taking on colors and forms that defied natural law. The very air around the garden seemed to shimmer with heat that had nothing to do with the sun, and animals gave the area a wide berth, sensing dangers there. Instincts couldn't name but absolutely refused to ignore. Martha and the other elder women began to understand what was coming. They recognized the signs from stories their own grandmothers had told, tales of women pushed beyond endurance who had found ways to balance the scales of justice using methods that civilized society preferred to forget. "She's calling on the old powers," Martha whispered to her most trusted friends. "The kind that our people knew back in the motherland, before the ships came and took us away from everything sacred. Powers that don't forgive, don't forget, and don't show mercy to those who show none to others." The workers found themselves caught between terror and a dark satisfaction. They knew that whatever Celia was planning would likely bring terrible consequences for all of them, but they also understood that some wrongs were so deep, so fundamental, that they demanded payment in blood. On the morning of November 15th, Celia began her final preparations. She worked alone, having dismissed the kitchen helpers with instructions to stay away until summoned. The sounds that emerged from behind the closed kitchen doors were unlike anything the workers had ever heard. Not quite singing, not quite chanting, but something that seemed to come from the throat of the earth itself. Strange smells began to drift from the kitchen as the day wore on. Not unpleasant exactly, but unsettling in ways that made people's stomachs clench with unnamed anxiety. The aromas seemed to carry whispers, promises, threats that bypassed the conscious mind and spoke directly to the part of the soul that remembered when humans were prey animals hiding from predators in the dark. As evening approached and the first carriages began arriving with their cargo of unsuspecting guests, Celia made her final preparations. She bathed and dressed in her finest clothes, a black dress that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, her hair wrapped in a headscarf that she had inherited from her grandmother, along with much darker gifts. She stood before the great feast she had prepared, 17 place settings arranged with mathematical precision, each dish calculated to deliver its payload with maximum efficiency. The dining room had been transformed into a temple of vengeance, though the guests who would soon fill it saw only the elegant trappings of southern hospitality. Candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. Crystal glasses caught the light and threw it back in patterns that hurt to follow for too long. The very air in the room felt thick with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath in preparation for what was to come. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, announcing that the dinner hour had arrived, Celia took her position in the shadows beside the kitchen door. From there, she would have a perfect view of the dining room, able to watch as her carefully crafted justice was served course by course to people who had never imagined that their victims might one day find the power to bite back. The guests began filing into the dining room, their laughter and conversation filling the space with sounds of life and celebration. They seated themselves at the long mahogany table, admiring the elaborate place settings and commenting on the delicious aromas that had begun to drift in from the kitchen. None of them noticed the woman standing motionless in the shadows, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like pools of black water. None of them sensed that they were walking into a trap that had been 3 years in the making, baited with their own cruelty and seasoned with a hatred so pure it had taken on a life of its own. Master Thornfield rose to offer a toast to his daughter's happiness and future prosperity, and 17 crystal glasses were raised in response. 17 people who had lived their entire lives believing they were untouchable were about to discover that some debts always come due, and some meals are worth dying for. The feast was about to begin. The dining room sparkled with the warm glow of dozens of candles, their flames casting dancing shadows across the faces of Mississippi's elite as they settled into their chairs around the massive mahogany table. Crystal glasses clinked in response to Master Thornfield's toast, and the air filled with the cultured laughter of people who had never known want, never questioned their place at the top of a system built on human suffering. Celia emerged from the kitchen carrying the first course, a delicate soup made from wild mushrooms she had gathered from the deepest, darkest parts of the swamp. The silver tureen gleamed in the candlelight as she moved with practiced grace around the table, ladling the aromatic broth into fine china bowls. "Magnificent as always, Celia," Master Thornfield declared, though he barely glanced at her as she served. To him she was just another piece of property, no more worthy of notice than the chairs his guests sat upon, or the silverware they used to eat. But tonight, Celia was so much more than that. Tonight she was justice personified, death wearing an apron, vengeance served at precisely the right temperature. The guests praised the soup's complex flavor, unaware that each spoonful contained ingredients that had been carefully selected and prepared according to recipes that predated written history. Mushrooms that grew only in places where the dead lay buried, herbs that had absorbed the essence of suffering from the very soil they sprouted from, spices that had been blessed by powers that civilized society had forgotten, but never truly banished. As the first course was cleared and the second brought out, roasted quail stuffed with cornbread dressing, the conversation flowed as freely as the wine. Judge Morrison regaled the table with stories of recent court cases, describing the harsh sentences he had handed down to uppity slaves, with the casual satisfaction of a man discussing successful hunting expeditions. Colonel Patterson and his wife shared gossip about neighboring plantations, comparing notes on which overseers were most effective at maintaining discipline and which enslaved families were producing the strongest workers. They spoke of human beings as livestock, calculating their worth in dollars and cents while consuming food prepared by hands that had every reason to hate them. None of them noticed how their server moved through the room like a shadow given form, her footsteps silent on the polished wooden floors, her presence so unobtrusive that they often forgot she was there at all. This invisibility, forced upon her by a lifetime of bondage, had become her greatest weapon. The third course arrived. Venison, steaks so tender they could be cut with a fork, accompanied by roasted vegetables that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The meat had been marinated for days in a mixture that included herbs known to ancient practitioners as the devil's own seasoning, plants that could carry their effects through flesh and blood with surgical precision. Mrs. Weatherby complimented the meal's presentation while simultaneously complaining about the impossible standards expected by house servants these days. Her husband nodded in agreement, sharing his theory that enslaved people were naturally lazy and required constant supervision to produce acceptable work. As the evening progressed and more courses were served, the guests began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. The candle flames seemed to flicker more violently, creating shadows that moved in ways that defied the laws of physics. The temperature in the room fluctuated unpredictably, alternating between stifling heat and bone-deep cold that made several guests pull their shawls tighter around their shoulders, but they were too engrossed in their conversations and too confident in their invulnerability to pay much attention to such minor details. After all, what did they have to fear in their own domain, surrounded by their own kind, protected by laws that existed solely to preserve their power? The main course was a masterpiece of culinary artistry, roasted duck glazed with a sauce that seemed to shift color in the candlelight, accompanied by sweet potato soufflé that was so light it seemed to float above the plate. The guests attacked, their food with the enthusiasm of people who had never had to wonder where their next meal would come from, never had to watch their children go hungry while their masters feasted. It was Judge Morrison who first noticed something was wrong. He had been mid-sentence describing a particularly harsh punishment he had inflicted on a young enslaved woman who had dared to look him in the eye when his words began to slur. His face flushed red, then pale, then red again as his body struggled to process the toxins that were already racing through his bloodstream. "I feel," he began, then stopped, his hand moving to his throat as if something was blocking his airway. The other guests turned to look at him with mild concern, assuming he had simply eaten too quickly in his enthusiasm for Celia's excellent cooking. But then Mrs. Patterson began to cough, a harsh, wet sound that echoed off the dining room walls like gunshots. Her elegant evening gown was soon stained with foam that bubbled from her lips, and her carefully arranged hair came loose as she convulsed in her chair. The realization hit them slowly, then all at once. This wasn't indigestion or overeating. This wasn't an accident or a coincidence. This was murder, served with all the ceremony and attention to detail that they would have expected from any other formal dinner party. Panic spread through the dining room like wildfire as the horrible truth became clear. Colonel Patterson tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor where he writhed in agony. His wife reached out to help him, but her own hands were shaking so violently that she couldn't maintain her grip on anything. Young Margaret Thornfield, the bride-to-be whose engagement they had gathered to celebrate, began screaming as her body was racked with spasms that bent her nearly in half. Her fiancé, a pompous young man who had inherited 3 plantations and 1,000 enslaved souls, could only watch in horror as his future wife suffered, his own vision already blurring as whatever poison coursed through the meal began its inexorable work. The dining room erupted into chaos as 17 souls realized they were dying in the most agonizing way imaginable. They clawed at their throats, rolled on the floor in convulsions, and screamed for help that would never come. Some tried to flee, but their legs would no longer support them. Others attempted to induce vomiting, but it was far too late for such measures. The candlelight flickered across their contorted faces, creating a scene that looked like something torn from the very depths of hell. Crystal glasses shattered as they fell from nerveless fingers. Fine china plates crashed to the floor, and the elaborate feast that had begun with such celebration became a grotesque still life of death and suffering. And through it all, Celia stood motionless in the kitchen doorway, watching with the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment. She made no attempt to flee, showed no emotion at the carnage unfolding before her. Her face remained as calm and impassive as a funeral mask, revealing nothing of the satisfaction that burned in her heart like a forge fire. She had planned this moment for 3 years, perfecting her craft, gathering her ingredients, waiting for the perfect opportunity to serve justice alongside dinner. Every spasm of pain, every gasping breath, every terrified scream was a small payment against the massive debt that these people had accumulated through their casual cruelty and systematic dehumanization of everyone they considered beneath them. One by one, the screams faded to whimpers, then to silence. One by one, the most powerful people in the county discovered that all their wealth and influence meant nothing when faced with an enemy they had never bothered to see as human. They died as they had lived, surrounded by luxury, but ultimately alone in their selfishness and cruelty. As the last breath escaped the last throat, as the final death rattle echoed off the dining room walls, Celia finally allowed herself a small smile. It was not an expression of joy or triumph, but of completion, the smile of someone who has finally finished a long and difficult task. Justice had been served. The Feast of Shadows was complete, and in the morning when the bodies were discovered, the legend of Celia would begin to spread like wildfire through a county that would never again feel quite as safe or secure as it had before this terrible night. 3 weeks after the massacre, Celia finally stood before a judge in the cramped courthouse that served the county's need for legal theater. The building itself seemed to shrink around the crowd that had gathered to witness what many considered the trial of the century, not because justice was expected, but because everyone wanted to look upon the face of a woman who had done the impossible. She entered the courtroom in shackles, moving with the same unhurried grace that had characterized Her movements in the kitchen, the chains around her wrists and ankles seemed almost decorative, as if she wore them by choice rather than necessity. Her dark eyes swept the packed courtroom with neither defiance nor submission, but with a kind of patient interest, as if she were observing an elaborate performance staged for her entertainment. Judge Whitmore, hastily appointed to replace the late Judge Morrison, was a nervous man who had spent the previous weeks drinking heavily and jumping at shadows. He had been reluctant to take the case, but pressure from the surviving plantation owners had left him with little choice. Someone had to preside over this mockery of justice, and it might as well be him. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney Pierce, a young man eager to make his reputation on what seemed like an open and shut case. After all, Celia had been found at the scene of the crime, had made no attempt to flee, and had offered no denial of her actions. How difficult could it be to convict a woman who had clearly murdered 17 people? But as the trial progressed, Pierce discovered that nothing about this case was as simple as it appeared. The first witnesses were the surviving enslaved workers who had discovered the bodies. They testified with obvious reluctance, their voices barely above whispers as they described the scene in the dining room. But when Pierce pressed them for details about Celia's behavior in the weeks leading up to the massacre, their answers became evasive, contradictory, almost incomprehensible. She was different, old Martha testified when forced to take the stand. Been different since the day she arrived. But different how, you ask? Can't rightly say, just different. Like looking at a deep well in the dark. You know there's something down there, but you can't see what it is, and maybe you don't want to. Dr. Hayes provided testimony about the physical evidence, but his medical expertise seemed inadequate to explain what he had observed. He spoke of symptoms that didn't match any known poisons, of death expressions that suggested terror beyond human comprehension, of bodies that had been found in positions that defied the natural progression of poisoning. In my professional opinion, Hayes stated, his voice shaking slightly, these people died of fear as much as they did of any toxic substance. I've seen battlefield casualties, victims of horrible accidents, but nothing that prepared me for what I observed in that dining room. The defense attorney, a reluctant public defender named Harrison who had drawn the short straw, made little effort to mount a meaningful defense. How could he argue innocence when his client sat silent as stone, offering no explanation, no alibi, no expression of remorse? He went through the motions of questioning witnesses, but his heart clearly wasn't in the task. When the prosecution called for testimony about Celia's character and behavior, the witnesses painted a picture that seemed to come from a nightmare rather than a courtroom. They spoke of strange lights around her cabin, of animals that died after crossing her path, of food that made people ill in ways that doctors couldn't explain. Mrs. Henderson, a neighboring plantation owner's wife, testified through tears about a dinner party where Celia had served as cook. 3 of my guests took ill that very night, she sobbed. They spoke of terrible dreams, visions of dead relatives warning them about something awful coming. At the time, I thought it was just bad fish, but now I wonder if she was practicing on us, preparing for something bigger. But the most damaging testimony came from Briggs, the overseer who had learned early to avoid Celia entirely. He described his mysterious illness, the boils that had appeared overnight and disappeared just as suddenly, the nightmares that had plagued him for months afterward. She cursed me, he declared, his voice cracking with conviction. Put some kind of hex on me for doing my job. That woman ain't natural, ain't human. She's something else wearing human skin. Something that should have been burned at the stake instead of brought to trial. Throughout all of this testimony, Celia sat motionless, in her chair, her face revealing nothing. She didn't react to the accusations, didn't respond to the increasingly fantastic claims about her supernatural abilities, didn't even seem to be listening to the proceedings that would determine her fate. When Judge Whitmore finally asked if she had anything to say in her own defense, Celia looked up for the first time during the trial. Her dark eyes met his across the courtroom, and for a moment, every person present felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. No, she said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. It was the only word she spoke during the entire trial, but it carried with it a weight that made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. The verdict was inevitable, delivered by 12 white men who wanted nothing more than to return to their homes and try to forget what they had seen and heard. Guilty on 17 counts of murder in the first degree. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. But even as Judge Whitmore pronounced the sentence, even as the crowd in the courtroom murmured its approval, everyone present understood that this trial had raised more questions than it had answered. They had convicted Celia of murder, but they had not explained how she had accomplished it, or why their elaborate system of control had failed so spectacularly to contain her. As the bailiffs led her away in chains, Celia turned one last time to look at the courtroom full of people who thought they had defeated her. Her slight smile suggested that she knew something they didn't, something that would continue to haunt their dreams long after her body had been laid to rest. The trial was over, but the legend was just beginning. Celia went to her death as she had lived her final years, in perfect, unnerving silence. The hanging was scheduled for dawn on December 3, 1855, but even as the noose was placed around her neck, she showed no fear, no remorse, no emotion at all beyond that same patient satisfaction that had characterized her demeanor since the night of the massacre. The crowd that gathered to witness her execution was smaller than expected. Many of the county's residents found excuses to be elsewhere that morning, as if they feared that watching her die might somehow invite her curse upon themselves. Those who did attend stood at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves about whether rope could really hold something that might not be entirely human. Sheriff Coleman, who had drawn the unwelcome duty of carrying out the sentence, later claimed that Celia's last words were barely audible, spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Others swore she said nothing at all, that she went to her death as silently as she had lived. But everyone agreed on one detail. She smiled as the trap door opened beneath her feet. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the county's pauper cemetery, far from the elaborate monuments that marked the resting places of her victims. The authorities hoped that forgetting where she lay would help the community move past the horror she had inflicted, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. Within weeks of the execution, strange stories began to circulate throughout Mississippi. Travelers reported seeing a woman matching Celia's description, walking the back roads at night, always heading in the direction of some plantation or another. Kitchen workers at great houses found their pantries mysteriously disturbed, ingredients moved or rearranged in patterns that made no earthly sense. The old Thornfield plantation, now abandoned and slowly surrendering to the encroaching wilderness, became a focal point for supernatural activity. Visitors reported seeing lights moving through the windows of the empty house, smelling the aroma of cooking food drifting from the rusted remains of the kitchen, hearing the sound of footsteps in rooms where no one walked. Local folklore transformed Celia from a woman into something far more powerful and enduring. Parents began using her story to frighten misbehaving children, warning them that the ghost of the poisoner still walked the county roads, looking for new victims to serve her final meal. Adults, meanwhile, whispered different warnings, that any cook who attempted to recreate Celia's dishes would invite her malevolent spirit into their own kitchen. The most persistent legend concerned her recipes themselves. It was said that Celia had written down her cooking methods in a journal that disappeared after her arrest, and that this book contained not just instructions for preparing food, but actual curses that could be activated by anyone foolish enough to follow them precisely. Food prepared according to Celia's methods would spoil instantly, or worse, would seem perfectly normal, until the moment it touched human lips. As the decades passed and the original witnesses died off, the story grew, more elaborate with each retelling. Some claimed Celia had been a witch from birth, trained in the dark arts by her grandmother who had brought forbidden knowledge from Africa. Others insisted she had made a pact with the devil himself, trading her soul for the power to destroy her enemies. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her legend was its persistence. Long after the plantation system had crumbled, long after the Civil War had officially ended slavery, people still spoke of Celia in hushed tones. Her story became a reminder that some hungers can never be satisfied, some wrongs can never be forgiven, and some spirits refuse to rest until justice has been fully served. Today, more than a century and a half after that terrible night, the ruins of the Thornfield plantation still stand as a monument to the darkness that can grow in human hearts. Visitors report feeling watched when they walk among the crumbling walls, and some swear they can still smell the aroma of cooking food, drifting on the wind. The legend lives on, ensuring that Celia's Last Supper is never forgotten and never truly finished.